Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Alcohol and Other Drug Knowledge community of NASPA Region 1, we're pleased to sponsor today's course, Proactive Overdose Prevention on Campus, Lessons from the University of Texas at Austin. How college campuses are responding to the opioid epidemic is an important topic, and we thank you for registering and joining us today. The AODKC, or Alcohol and Other Drug Knowledge community, is one of some 30 some odd KCs that disseminate knowledge or information about a certain topic. And you as a NASPA member can always join one or more KCs in your region. You can check it out on Volunteer Central on the NASPA website. If you know of colleagues that could not join us today, have no worries. A recording of this session will be made available to registered participants through the NASPA online learning community. I am pleased to introduce our two presenters today. Both are faculty members from the University of Texas at Austin, one of the largest public universities in the US with over 50,000 students enrolled and some 10,000 students living on campus. Lucas Hill earned his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Pharmacy. Dr. Hill is now a clinical assistant professor of health outcomes and pharmacy practice at the University of Texas at Austin College of Pharmacy. Dr. Hill is director of Operation Naloxone, an interprofessional collaborative that provides overdose prevention, training, and resources to health professionals, educational institutions, and the public. He is the principal investigator for the Texas Targeted Opioid Response Overdose Prevention Project. Dr. Lori Holleran-Steiker, an addictions therapist turned educator scholar, is a distinguished professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work and is the Director of Instruction, Engagement, and Wellness for UT Undergraduate Studies. She researches drug and alcohol interventions with expertise in adolescent and emerging adult substance use recovery. She spearheaded overdose prevention and response initiatives on the University of Texas campus, helping start Operation Naloxone. She is also the founder and board member of University High School, Central Texas's first recovery high school. We are very pleased today to have both Lucas and Lori share their expertise and experience with us this afternoon. Our goal in conducting this course today is that you will be able to recognize the risk for overdose death among college students, discuss the role of naloxone in overdose prevention efforts, describe the overdose prevention model at the University of Texas at Austin, and plan for implementation of proactive overdose prevention policies on your own campus. I will now turn things over to Lucas.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Lori and I are very excited to share what we've been able to do in collaboration with the administration here at the University of Texas and what we believe your institution could easily begin doing with a little bit of support and insight about the process. Dave already shared the key learning objectives, but I'll just throw them up here again so that you're focused on what we really want to achieve or want to help you achieve over the next hour. And we're going to try to do that by providing a fair amount of time for you to ask questions, because we know the things that we choose to cover might not perfectly overlap with the information that you need. I'm going to first start with a poll to capture a general idea of where your campus is at regarding overdose prevention and naloxone. So these are slightly abbreviated, so I'll expand as you're looking at it, but please give us an idea of whether your campus is prepared for overdoses and has naloxone accessible to students in public areas and is providing overdose prevention education, or if you have naloxone but it's only in a student employee clinic or a university health office, but you're considering expansion to other public areas. If you're considering options for overdose prevention and naloxone, but you don't really have it in stocked anywhere on campus, or at least that you're aware of at the moment, or not so sure what naloxone is at this point, or at least on campus, there's not much awareness of it.
Okay, so a couple more people still have to get in there. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond, and then I will share out the results. Okay, looks good.
Okay, so it looks like about half of respondents have naloxone somewhere on campus, but nobody seems to have it necessarily in a public area for a potential student or other responder who's not a staff member or a health staff member. And I'm glad to see that the vast majority are in at least a later stage of consideration around this topic. So thank you very much for sharing that information. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a foundation of knowledge around opioids for this discussion, because we're really talking primarily about opioid overdose in the context of naloxone. Opioids come from the opium poppy. I've actually seen these growing legally in the United States, but what's not legal is to score the outside. So any Game of Thrones fans probably heard of milk of the poppy. That's milk of the poppy, the stuff that leaks out when you score an opium poppy. It dries up and it turns into a sticky substance that can be smoked, opium. And about in the early 1800s, it's hard to believe that something, a chemical, could have been synthesized that long ago, but in about 1800, a chemist was able to isolate what they found to be the active ingredient in opium. That active ingredient was morphine. So morphine was utilized mostly for soldiers, pain management, as a surgical anesthetic for about 100 years. And there was a growth in the development of something called soldier's disease, or an opioid addiction type syndrome with morphine. So a very pioneering, thoughtful pharmaceutical company decided they were going to come up with a slightly different version of morphine, and they would market it as a way to get off of morphine, to manage that addiction, and as an even better management drug for pain. And Bayer came out with that, and it was called heroin. So in around 1900, heroin was actually marketed by a pharmaceutical company for pain management and as a replacement for morphine. Unfortunately, the underlying chemistry thought process there wasn't very clear, because heroin is a much more potent opioid, crosses into the brain much more readily. So we've been moving in a direction of generally of less potency for opioids ever since. This has culminated in the development of hydrocodone, or generic Vicodin, which a lot of you are probably familiar with from the show House. That was developed and released in the mid-1970s, and I was shocked when I started working in a pharmacy in 2006 to see that that generic version of Vicodin was actually the most prescribed drug in the United States, and that was true up until 2013. So we had about an 8-year period where that was king. That was the top drug in the pharmacy. So not surprisingly, this fixation on opioids, it's had some problematic outcomes for the United States. And you've probably heard about this in popular media. Some journalists reporting that drug overdose has surpassed motor vehicle crashes as the leading cause of injury death in the US. That's actually been true since 2008. But the lines have continued to diverge as cars are becoming safer and drugs, for some reason, are literally becoming more dangerous. Now, again, this is a graph of fatalities from all drug overdoses, not just opioids. That's true in this graph as well. But if we look and we pull that data up through 2016, you'll see that drug overdoses actually had killed more people in 2015 than HIV/AIDS did at the peak of that crisis, and certainly far more individuals in the US than car accidents and guns at this point. So the overall trend on drug overdoses has been remarkable. There's been a massive and sustained increase since about 1990. There are varying viewpoints on why this has occurred, but when you look just at the time relationship, there's no doubt that much of this growth was a result of opioid overprescribing. There were some changes that incentivized more pain assessment and unfortunately accidentally incentivized opioid prescribing that were implemented in the late 1990s. Over the following decade, opioid prescribing quadrupled and opioid overdose deaths quadrupled right alongside them. Looking specifically just at opioid overdose deaths, we did see some changes in the healthcare system that caused overdose deaths from prescription opioids to plateau around 2010. Now, that started to go up again, but at least we saw some slowing in the growth. Prescription monitoring programs, crush-resistant OxyContin, prescriber education. However, all of those interventions had the unfortunate public health consequence of driving people to the illicit opioid market. From 2010 to 2013, heroin overdoses tripled. Heroin is now it's not available as a pharmaceutical, except in a few countries, but it's part of that illicit opioid market. It has the same sort of effects as prescription opioids, but we know there's increased danger when from batch to batch the dose is potentially much more variable than with a prescription opioid. Heroin is no longer the only illicit opioid that we need to worry about. Unfortunately, fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, and it is a drug that's available in some forms in the US as a pharmaceutical, but the version that's showing up inside of heroin in the US is actually being created as a powder formulation in clandestine labs, mostly in China. It's being added to heroin because it's 50 to 100 times more potent. That means 50 to 100 times smaller package for the same overall high or the same profit for a drug dealer. So it's easier to move across a border, easier to mail. The same is true for carfentanil, which is significantly more potent again than fentanyl. So preliminary evidence is showing that in some states, including most recently in Ohio, that the vast majority of heroin overdose deaths actually were due more so to fentanyl that was inside of the heroin. So we've got to worry a little bit more about these ultra potent opioids than just about heroin. And heroin's supposed to be scary, but all of a sudden we have things entering the market that are much worse. The most recent graph of breakdown of opioid overdose deaths shows that this has changed from being mostly a prescription problem to being mostly an illicit problem. Heroin and these ultra-potent fentanyl versions killed more than 35,000 people in 2016, and that far outpaces prescription opioids. Overall, about 70% of all drug overdose deaths are due to opioids. So being able to reverse the effects of an opioid with a medication, with a potent antidote, is very appealing because that's going to get to the root of most drug overdoses. As a primer on how opioids and naloxone work in the body, take a look at this depiction. Those blue circles are opioid molecules. Let's say that's heroin or fentanyl that a student may have ingested. That floats around in the body and eventually it finds its way to an opioid receptor, those green lightning bolts. When an opioid molecule attaches to an opioid receptor, you get relief from pain, euphoric or positive feeling. You may get some side effects like constipation, oversedation, and if they attach to a certain kind of receptor that's on the brainstem, a certain opioid receptor in kind of the base part of your brain that manages unconscious processes, it can also stop your breathing. So opioids kill you by stopping your breathing. Ultimately, the lungs stop, the rest of your body doesn't get oxygen, and the heart stops later, but breathing stops first. So it's a little bit different than a cardiac arrest or a situation where you're used to hearing about CPR. If you get naloxone, that green bubbly circle, if you get that into someone's body, either by injecting it into their muscle or squirting some into their nose, it can get to those receptors and it has a stronger binding affinity. It fits better on those receptors. So it'll knock that opioid out of the way, attach to the receptor, and it doesn't have any opioid-like effect. It doesn't cause pain relief. It doesn't give euphoric feelings, but it doesn't suppress breathing. It just gets in the way of the opioid so that the opioid can no longer have any of those effects. Even a small amount of naloxone can go a long way against an ultra-potent opioid. So naloxone has not been proven to be ineffective for any opioid, or how potent. Be on the lookout for some false public statements around that topic. Naloxone, however, only works for about 30 to 90 minutes, and it depends on the version and the dose, but that's a good general rule. So Naloxone is not an absolute safety blanket. An opioid that's in a person's body may last much longer than 30 or 90 minutes. So it's very important that they have emergency medical services responding to the scene so that the individual gets other support. Additionally, oftentimes you're not 100% sure whether or not what you're seeing is an opioid overdose. People don't tend to die with a needle sticking out of their arm and a handful of pills. Oftentimes it's an hour or two after the initial drug use. So anyone who's found down who isn't breathing but does still have a heartbeat would be a great person to get naloxone. It can't cause any harm. It can't be misused. The only negative effect that naloxone could have is that in a person who uses opioids chronically, it could induce an acute withdrawal syndrome. Acute withdrawal from opioids is very uncomfortable, but it is almost never fatal. And I have to say almost because people with some really severe underlying diseases could have a protracted opioid withdrawal that ultimately could be associated with death. But when we're talking about saving someone from being unable to breathe, there's no argument. All of the medical and pharmaceutical societies agree naloxone has huge benefit and extremely low risk. I describe it to people as a fire extinguisher. Think to yourself or raise your hand in the room if you have a fire extinguisher at home. Now, keep your hand raised if you've had to use it. I'm guessing that many of you didn't have to keep your hand raised, but you had the fire extinguisher at home. It's the same thing in this situation. If a person's taking opioids chronically, or we have a population that we know is likely to experiment with drugs, we should have naloxone around just in case. Naloxone comes in many different versions, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but if you go to our website, operationnaloxone.org, we made a YouTube video that shows how to administer every possible version. It comes in an intramuscular vial and syringe, all the way down to an intramuscular auto-injector that talks to you when you open it, or Narcan nasal spray, which is a concentrated spray that you just squirt into someone's nose. Naloxone access laws have been passed in all 50 US states and the District of Columbia, and I would encourage you to check out the Prescription Drug Abuse Policy System website that will provide more information about the specific law in your state. Generally speaking, these laws do include 3 core components. The first core component is the ability to have a standing order. That is that a physician usually can sign essentially a renewable prescription for a pharmacist or another organization to dispense naloxone without a prescription. Naloxone is not an over-the-counter medication. It does require a prescription right now, but these standing orders allow a way around that so that a pharmacist or even a non-medical person could distribute naloxone under the authority of a physician. It also allows third-party prescribing. So, for example, in our campus pharmacy, we have a standing order in place so that pharmacists can distribute and prescribe naloxone on their own. And third-party prescribing means that a person who's not actually at risk but is worried about someone else who might be at risk could get naloxone directly prescribed to them. So, for example, I'm worried about my brother. I go to the 40 Acres Pharmacy on campus. I ask for naloxone and I explain that it's to potentially save the life of another person. That pharmacist can dispense it directly to me without a prescription. The last component is broad liability protection. And this is in every access law to my knowledge. Any person who prescribes, dispenses, administers, or does not do any of those things with naloxone is protected from any liability for anything that might happen. So if you try to give naloxone to somebody but you administer it incorrectly, if you give naloxone to someone to administer to themselves and they do it the wrong way, or anything goes wrong, nobody in that situation is at any risk for liability because the evidence is so overwhelmingly clear that increasing naloxone access saves lives. Now, I'm going to ask you to please send any questions that you have right now, and Dave will read out some pertinent ones to me. And this is, remember, this is just the first section. So Lori's going to talk a little bit more about what we've done on campus, and we'll address some of your questions about that at the end. But if you have specific questions about opioid overdoses, how naloxone works, what some negative effects of naloxone could be, please send those in. And while you're sending those questions, I want to point you to our website again, operationnaloxone.org. Under the resources tab, we have a proposed campus overdose prevention policy, as well as some other key resources, a place where you could get request free Narcan nasal spray, a version of naloxone, directly from Adapt Pharma. And we have continuing education programs for healthcare providers, potentially if you want to share those with your clinic staff associated with your university or college. So again, please send in any questions that you have over this first section so we can kind of summarize those before we move into specific campus logistics.
Hi everyone, this is Dave. I'm not seeing any questions come in right now, and that's okay. If you do have some questions about some more of the background that Lucas was doing in terms of the setup of this presentation, feel free to submit them and we can address them at the end. But at this time, Lori, we'll hand it off to you to talk more about the actual operation naloxone.
Fantastic. So let me start by talking a little bit about the background on college campuses. We do know that there's been an increase in the amount of prescription drugs utilized by college students, and here we're going to be speaking particularly about opioids, but of course misusing prescription drugs could include other prescribed medications, but we did see an increase between 1993 and 2005 in the percentage of college students using and misusing prescription drugs, increasing exponentially, and numbers continue to rise. Particular to opioids, we've seen, according to the Clinton Health Matters Initiative in 2014, over 343% increase in opioid use among college students on campuses. 50% of the college students are offered a prescription drug for non-medical use by their sophomore year. And that actually is a study done by Dr. Arya in 2008. So we anticipate that those numbers may be even higher. And we found that in terms of demographics, the problem is most prevalent among highly selective and urban colleges. In surveys, college students who took an opioid for reasons other than pain relief had much greater risk of experiencing 3 or more drug-related problems. Persons that are, when we're talking about the age group 18 to 25, I think it's important for me to go back just for a second and note that the science has showed quite definitively that college students are still within the period of time that the brain development is in plasticity and activity. So they tend to be similar to adolescents in terms of the impact of their misuse. We know that they're more likely than any other age group to have misused a prescription drug in the past year, to have used any illicit drug in the past month, and to have used heroin in the past month. This slide is basically to demonstrate to you, those of you that do anything related to diagnosis, and to make the point more generally, that there's been a shift in the way that we define substance use disorders for all age groups. The DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual 4, had used basically the criteria of hazardous use, social and interpersonal problems, neglecting major roles of use, legal problems, and they had differentiated between abuse and dependence, with the more bio and physiological aspects of withdrawal, tolerance, using in larger amounts, attempts to quit, time spent using, physical and psychological problems, and activities given up due to use. What the DSM-5 has done, and we think quite presciently, is to shift from this dichotomy between abuse and dependence, which basically says either you are a person with a full-blown substance use disorder or you're not, to a much more inclusive continuum for substance use disorders, that is mild, moderate, or severe, so that we don't get caught up in determining whether or not the person that we're working with on a college campus is somebody with a disrupted pleasure pathway, a brain-centered addiction, or somebody that is just misusing, or even the term self-medicating is pretty common on college campuses. We encourage you, as a part of this webinar, to note that there's no real way to tell whether the person sitting in front of you is at risk for opioid overdose or not. I mean, there are clues, but some of the things that you would think would be discriminating factors in the midst of an assessment may or may not be evident. And so we want you to be responding in an inclusive way, and when it comes to overdose prevention, playing a very conservative and safe game. This slide, we really want to make sure that you understand that it is very, very difficult for a person with a substance use disorder to reach out for help. For the most part, I think that there's this general pervasive perception that people with substance use disorders are in denial. A lot of time it's not as much denial as it is fear that somebody is going to intervene with their use when this is something that they're so desperately in need of, in terms of their sensation of needing it for survival. I want to add one more piece that we tend to share with people that I think changes people's perception, that when somebody that the research shows when somebody is experiencing compulsion to use or a craving, that they found that that craving exists in the same part of the brain, actually the reptilian brain, the most primal and basic part of the brain, along with other instincts like breathing or drinking water or procreating, or all of the survival instincts like fight or flight. So for us to think that logic alone would help somebody, I think that it's a misconception. The stigma is still incredibly pervasive in our communities and on college campuses, where the norms may actually embrace substance use as a social mechanism. Stigma may be even higher for students who will feel that there'll be a tremendous loss socially if they reach out for help. So we want to be very sensitive how we connect with our campuses around these subjects. And one of the ways that we have figured out is very important is to consider the language that we use around substance use disorders. And even our national agencies like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration still use the term substance abuse, but we have concerns about that term. A person with an eating disorder would rarely, if ever, be accused of being a food abuser. The person-centered language of a person with a substance use disorder is not only more respectful, but it's something that does not imply all the negative connotations that go along with the word abuse. I think it's so common in our society for the media and for even helping professionals to highlight the ugliness of the disease. And so what we're working on shifting right now is focusing more on the promise of improvement, the possibilities of safety when it comes to substances, and really acknowledging that when a person is out of control, out of their own personal control with drug or alcohol use, that's not a moral failing or any type of weakness, that is centered in the brain and is something that that person would need assistance with. So instead of saying a person with a substance, instead of saying addict, junkie, or druggie, or any of the common terms, the more negative terms for addiction, we tend to use person with a substance use disorder. Instead of saying an ex-addict, we talk about a person in long-term recovery or living in recovery. We try not to use the term drug offender. We try to refer to those individuals who have had issues with the justice system as people that have been arrested for drug violations. Those that have been, we tend to sometimes use resistant client or non-compliant person instead of someone that's not choosing to engage with help at this time. Medication as a crutch is a frame that can also induce stigma, and instead we talk about medication as a treatment tool. And even the term relapse, we know to date that opioid recovery, opioid use disorder recovery can be profoundly challenging, and that very often recurrence of use is part of somebody's recognition of their illness, can even be a necessary part in someone's recovery process. So we tend to refer to them as recurrence of use or a setback. Instead of the terms clean and dirty, even for drug screens, we try to use maintaining recovery as a concept and referring to drug screens as positive drug screens if they've come back with some substances in them. I think that the language is not something that we are just talking about in terms of the value of semantics among intellectual communities in academia. There has been some really compelling research. John Kelly out of Harvard has done some research where there was a substance use disorder scenario that was described identically in two different conditions, but in one condition it was described as a substance abuser or a drug addict, and in the other scenario it used the more correct language, the more sensitive language of a person with a substance use disorder. And even among helping professionals, the perception from the study was that those that those that were responding to the scenario of somebody described as having a substance use disorder predicted a much better prognosis for that person, said that that person was much more likely to get the job or have a roommate or have a successful career. And with the same exact scenario, with those negative and stigma attached terms, the perception was that that person's prognosis was much worse. So in terms of setting the foundation on your campus, I'm going to tell the story in sort of a narrative fashion, using these slides as a springboard so that you can follow along with the unfolding, because no implementation of a new program or set of policies on campus is linear. So I'm going to tell you about how it happened on our campus, and depending on the climate at your university and the resources available, your story and your unfolding may look very different. But I'm going to say that what happened initially was, over one of our Christmas breaks, we actually heard from the folks that we were working with in the community settings, the practitioners on the street and those that were associated with our harm reduction coalition reported that there were several deaths of university students over Christmas break related to opioids. And I'm going to be very pointed about insisting that if you're going to set up a program on campus around opioid response, that it would be a terrible mistake to not join with and utilize the expertise and the wisdom and the practice abilities of the community organizations who work in these situations on a regular basis every single day. We had a relationship through our recovery-oriented system of care with something called TONY, the Texas Overdose Naloxone Initiative. And it was the folks from the TONY that had sort of clued us in that there was the opioid problem had not only hit our campus, but it had led to some fatalities. We immediately went to some administrators that we felt comfortable would understand the importance and the the critical nature of setting up programs on campus. We went to student affairs, one of the vice presidents of student affairs who was over the mental health center, the counseling and mental health center. We went to, here it's Dr. Chris Brownson, and he immediately had a list of folks who he felt we ought to talk with about this issue. And it included such areas as the University of Texas Police Department. It included housing and the residential department, and it included a variety of other settings. But that was where we first found that we were able to have a foot in the door. The director of housing, food and housing, noted that they were having a resident advisor training that was a mandatory training for all on-campus RAs. And the beauty of that was they just agreed to have us present about recognizing when an opioid overdose was happening, how to respond with rescue mechanisms. At the time, because it was early in our orienting the campus to the idea of naloxone, there wasn't a great deal of comfort initially with the idea of having our RAs administering naloxone, but we figured that because our 911 call had an 8 to 10 minute time frame in terms of response, that it would be better to have students able to recognize when an overdose was happening, be able to do rescue breathing, know to call 911, know to stay by the person's side until help was available. Even those 4 basic responses were a great start for our campus. And what wound up happening was that the off-campus folks, the off-campus RAs, were invited to training, and more than half of those RAs opted to come to the training, most of all because they knew that the deaths had occurred in an off-campus dorm. So we were able to do those trainings even before there was a sense of comfort with administering naloxone. What happened was once Dr. Hill got involved and a larger committee was formed, we were able to start to educate folks about who might be appropriate for being involved in making more extensive inroads on the university campus. So the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs, through something called the University of Texas Wellness Network, actually created a committee that involved social work faculty, pharmacists, the University of Texas Center for Students in Recovery, the UT Center, student group, it's a sponsored student group, Students for Sensible Drug Policies. The UT Police were present at our task force meetings, Housing and Food Services, as I've already referred to, the Texas Overdose Naloxone Initiative. So we made sure that we had Mark Kinsley and other experts at the table so that it wasn't just the university committee, it was our community partners, and the Texas Harm Reduction Coalition. So the beauty of having everyone involved at the table was we actually wound up adding to this group, and we had representatives of the Greek system present. We had students from something called the Drug and Alcohol Peer Advisors, which had grown out of one of our larger undergraduate courses, Young People in Drugs. And so little by little, as soon as the community was formed, it started to grow in terms of people's desire to be involved and growing awareness. Let me say one more thing. We were able to form a committee called the Committee on Substance Safety and Overdose Prevention, which meets regularly as part of the Wellness Network. And we've done a variety of harm reduction activities, not just making sure that there's naloxone on campus, but we also did a drug take-back day, and there's a variety of harm reduction mechanisms for campus that can be initiated once you're thinking along these lines, that they don't just serve in specific situations, but they also serve campus-wise to shift the culture, raise awareness, and lower stigma around these issues. In terms of accessing the specific naloxone that we are now distributing on campus, the donations were secured from a community harm reduction organization via the manufacturers of the naloxone, and Adapt Pharma offered 4 boxes of Narcan nasal spray free to any U.S. college or university. And so we're going to make sure that you have access to as many of those resources as possible by the end of this webinar. Our University of Texas Police Department were very interested in being trained. We fortunately had Captain Carter, who was someone that had, when he was out as part of a police force, had gone onto the scene where he believed somebody had died of an overdose, and he watched EMT come administer naloxone, and said that he almost fell out of his seat when he saw the person sit up from what looked like death to him and start speaking with the police department representative. So he absolutely was committed to having every single member of his University of Texas Police Department trained. He has offered to be an advocate for other university police departments if you feel that there's resistance in their understanding or interest in being trained. But we were able to train over 100 officers, and who they themselves actually had shared some very poignant and powerful experiences with encountering people with overdoses. In the resident halls, we now have more than 250 resident advisors trained to identify and respond to an opioid overdose and to use naloxone at this point. So in every dorm, in every on every floor, in a commons area with an information desk, there's naloxone available. And in some of the areas, there are what we are calling nalox boxes, where the naloxone is stored. I want to make it very, very clear that if you see the lock part, there's no reason in the world why this should be kept locked. So if you'll notice down the bottom, the key is hanging from the box. We would rather somebody take it if they think that they would have a use for it. So, so actually, the primary purpose of the nalox box is, one, so it's in a primary area like a fire extinguisher, so that the students know where these where the naloxone is kept. And two, it is better if it is kept cool, so some of them are refrigerated. The UT College of Pharmacy itself has trained over 400 student pharmacists in terms of outreach events, and we've recently added 40 medical and social work students to this campus-wide training opportunities, and we're very excited that they are not only open-minded about it, but wanting to be trained as trainers to train others on the community. We do tabling to make students aware. There are specific trainings. The students are very, very proud of what they're doing, and we're very proud of particularly our pharmacy department, which is making sure that absolutely all of our pharmacists that are being trained at University of Texas will leave knowing about naloxone and how to recognize an overdose and how to administer and also disseminate information about naloxone. Other ways that we're disseminating information is that we're trying to do as many local and regional interviews as possible, both in print and on camera. I think that it's important that we be able to do so, and I know that here at UT we actually have a media training, so I would suggest that if you would have concerns about what you should share and how you should share it, when it comes to media, but we also see it as an ethical responsibility to get the word out about how to prevent opioid overdose, not just on our campuses, but to our local community, to other universities, and nationally. We also have a Twitter site at Operation NLX and a Facebook site at Operation Naloxone. Those are kept populated pretty regularly with articles that have come out, interviews that are relevant. Whenever we see myths in the media, we try to get the word out about misinformation, because there's a tremendous amount of misinformation. So those are all part of our dissemination strategic plan. We also have played a pretty significant role in the Texas Overdose Awareness Day. We had a local one here in Central Texas, and I know that they're all over the state and nationally, and we call it TOAD. It's a really wonderful mechanism for bringing together the community, and it has a mix of folks that are working in harm reduction as well as families that have lost folks to opioid overdose. It's a really important mechanism for them to be able to share their experience, strength, and hope with others, and watch how we're making it different for students and families of the future. And we're also trying to present as many regional and national conferences for healthcare providers and academicians. So let me just review that in terms of recommendations. It's important for you to provide resources to prepare students, faculty, and staff for overdose response. It's important to recognize that it's not just for heroin overdose or even overdose when it comes to prescription medications. We know, for example, that opioids can be attenuated by alcohol. And so if somebody's being treated for pain and goes drinking, that can be a risk factor. So we want there to be sort of a universal attempt to educate about overdose response. You should collaborate and communicate effectively across departments and with professionals. Interdisciplinary has been very critical here on our campus, but it's also very important to include community members that are working on harm reduction and opioid prevention and response. Also, you can creatively overcome challenges by weaving policy, practice, and research into cohesive policies, and we want you to act as quickly as possible. There are lives to be saved. We know that on campuses, there's a great deal of bureaucracy in terms of shifting policies, turning the aircraft carrier, as we call it. But anything that we can do to help you make a difference on your campus, we hope that you'll take even small steps to do so. And our experience is that once you start making those steps, the reception to them is extremely good, and that it carves inroads for other possibilities. Our campus overdose prevention policy, we are making available to other universities. Of course, ours are specific to University of Texas, but this is one that can be adapted for any university setting and is available at operationnaloxone.org. So we're going to do a quick poll for you now that you have had this specific story of dissemination. So now that you've had this presentation, we're curious if you feel prepared to advocate for proactive overdose prevention today, and you can check multiple answers. We want to know if you're hoping to start a conversation about policies on your campus. We want to know, honestly, if you still feel a bit hesitant to engage in overdose prevention with naloxone. And if you're opposed to the policies described, it's valuable for us to know that as well. And perhaps you can let us know a little bit more about that now that we're going to open up for a question and answer period.
All right, so we do have some, as those, that quick poll number 2 is being answered. This is Dave Stender again on the call. I'm going to be reading some questions to field them for Lori and for Lucas. The first question is regarding use and management. Does an alarm go off when the box is opened? Is there some type of notification to someone when that happens?
Currently, there is no such alarm. While we advocated for greater availability of naloxone, such as storing it on multiple floors in the dorms, the ultimate decision from Residence Life was that it would be more manageable if the boxes were kept at staffed desks, which are centrally located on the ground floor of each dormitory or each cluster. So they're inside of a 24-hour staffed desk area. So there's not really the risk that these would be accessed by someone other than a resident advisor or an employee of the university. I think, at least from the standpoint of knowing that there's naloxone in every box, having an alarm system of some sort on boxes if they were located on individual floors would be a great idea. And I am starting to see some, not necessarily academic institutions, but other institutions or municipalities that are putting nalox boxes out in public spaces, and I believe they do have an alarm mechanism similar to a breaking a fire extinguisher container or something.
Do RAs have to be trained to administer CPR in order to then administer Narcan?
It's not CPR per se, it's rescue breathing. And I think that's there's a value in having a training where it's demonstrated, because I think that, almost any type of getting air into the lungs can be the thing that can make the difference. So it doesn't have to be perfect CPR per se, but I think students get scared to jump in there and do that. And if it's been trained and demonstrated, they're less resistant or hesitant. Lucas, do you agree?
I would say naloxone and overdose response would be a great thing to couple with basic life support and CPR if you are offering that to resident advisors. At UT, we do not. Many have gone through that training, but it's not a part of their orientation, and you don't need any sort of special certification to utilize naloxone. There's no need to have basic life support training. It certainly wouldn't hurt. And when I teach people about overdose response, it's easier to do so if they've had basic life support training, but it's not a requirement by any means. And if a person doesn't have a pulse, they're going to need basic life support and chest compressions. If they do have a pulse, but they're not breathing or they're not breathing sufficiently, then naloxone and rescue breathing may be sufficient. And I do highlight that difference.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions here left to answer. Are you seeing THC cartridges, oils being laced with fentanyl?
On our streets, we absolutely are. It's interesting that you would ask, because I think that there's mixed views of whether or not fentanyl is in the substances that are available to our students on campus. The rule of thumb is we're assuming that there is, and we're asking people to be very careful around that. We've even done some distributing of fentanyl test strips so that they can check if there is something in the substance that they might use. But I would emphasize that risk is absolutely present in almost every state in our nation at this point. Lucas, do you want to say anything specific?
I think from what I've seen, the highest risk drugs for fentanyl or other ultra-potent opioids are heroin, and then non-opioid drugs, certainly like cocaine and amphetamines. Any white powder substance is pretty easy to mix with fentanyl. I've heard a couple of isolated reports of K2 or spice, those sort of synthetic cannabinoids having fentanyl on them. But I've not heard of anyone actually overdosing from that, so I'm not sure how often that's happening. And I'm not aware of many instances of actual cannabis or THC preparations having it, but I have heard of one or two instances.
Do you guys have a slide that has your contact information at the end that you could put up? That's a
It
separate
is.
question. And then the last question from our participant is, how do you address misperceptions such as providing naloxone will just encourage students to use since they know they can be brought back?
Well, so all evidence points to the contrary. People who use drugs aren't stupid. And I think that presupposes a bit that they don't think about that situation. If you overdose, you are very likely to wake up in acute withdrawal, surrounded by emergency medical technicians and police. It is not a situation that you want to experience. And I have heard of some scenarios in which people were maybe going to use a new drug that they hadn't tried before, or something they thought might be more potent, and they made sure to have a friend nearby with naloxone, and that kind of thing gets vilified at times. But the reality is that's exactly what we should be teaching them to do. Safer use is important, and all evidence shows that in communities that have increased access to naloxone, overdose death rates have declined and admission to treatment programs has increased. So from an evidence standpoint, there's no doubt that that's not a concern that we really need to have.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone, for submitting your questions.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we had that came in today. I just really want to thank Lori and Lucas, both of you, for this amazing presentation. Yes, thank you for just really excellent information, and I hope it equips our attendees today with some ideas moving forward with how to implement a similar process on their own campus. As you can see, their contact information is up there on the screen, so I know they both hopefully will invite, if you have any additional questions, to reach out to them directly. I also want to thank Dave and the alcohol and other drug knowledge community for pulling this together today, and you can look for other presentations that they'll be doing in the online learning community. So with that, I want to wrap us up today. I hope you all have a great afternoon or evening. And once again, thank you, Lori and Lucas, so much.
Pleasure. Thank y'all.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
Welcome, Horns.